Hello, my name's Wendy Lundgaard. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia, and presenting at the International Conference on Diversity for Organisations, Communities and Nations. My topic today will be about workforce mobilisation to boost a culture of respect and safety and genuine inclusion. These are really important in the work that I do in my diversity practice and the workforce culture change practice with working with many organisations across Australia. And importantly, I would like to share with you some of the experiences and some of the feedback provided to me by employees at work on this really important topic, and how that has informed my thinking about models for making change. So in shaping the session outline, I've thought about just canvassing with you some of the disrespect that has identified in some of the sessions that I've run with organisations. I'd overlay that with research on incivility and workplace productivity, thinking about what we can do to mobilise an entire workforce, and think about it in terms of bystander activism. So I'll be sharing with you a model that I use to work with organisations, and in more detail break those down into component parts. And finally, to finish, what broader system supports need to be there to ensure that we can carry out this workforce mobilisation through bystander activism. When the Chief of Army encountered some fairly bad behaviour that happened in their cadet ranks, he was quoted as saying that the standard of behaviour we walk past is the standard we accept. And it was really a defining moment for the Army to take a good hard look at what they'd allowed to happen in the past, and considering what they would like to attract and who they would like to attract to the Army in the future, and aspiring to be a diverse employer. So it got us thinking around, what is it we tolerate? What is it we walk past? What is it we condone? And how influential is that in shaping the workplace culture? And we realised that it has a very significant effect. So it's something that we shouldn't just look to our leaders to fix. If the workforce culture is disrespectful, we need to all take a stand, because grassroots can have a big influence when we put the collective together and mobilise in a particular way. These are some of the thoughts from people who've shared their stories in workplaces that I've had the privilege of working with. What does disrespect look like? And it's going to be different for a lot of people, but it does have these same elements, from everyday casual racism and sexism through to exclusion, being selective in greetings, right through to the usual profanities and whispering and gossiping. These are not probably any surprise to you. I'm sure we've all had a close encounter at some point, and perhaps we've even been guilty of conducting ourselves in a way that may be seen as disrespectful by others. In Christine Porath's work in trying to capture and measure incivility, she came across some startling findings. 66% of employees will cut back their efforts in an organisation that does not curtail incivility at work. And a lot of time by employees is spent worrying when they have been impacted or seen someone close to them impacted by incivility at work, of which disrespect is a key element. Indeed, 12% have in fact moved with their feet and walked out on those workplaces that have allowed incivility to cultivate. And remember, this doesn't have to be extreme behaviour like some of the illegal practices of harassing and bullying. These are more subtle forms that have led people to take these actions, and this does have a significant impact for productivity and, importantly, employee well-being. So doing nothing is not really an option. So I want to in building a case for bystander activism, I want to give some tools and some strategies that could be useful in your organisation. But first, let's look at the difficulty in quantifying disrespect. It's defined as rude, unpleasant, inappropriate and unprofessional, but many of us know it in the forms that I've discussed before, those explicit examples. And there are varying shades of this, from the not nice, which is unintentional, hurtful, done once, through to intentional, has a more mean focus to it, through to the illegal. And what we've focused on in organisations, in my HR career, I've seen it done over the last 30 years, a lot of effort goes into compliance training and telling people what not to do so they stay inside the law. Yet there's this great big area where we don't often discuss, and we haven't got permission to have meaningful conversations around the not nice and the mean. And bearing in mind that intention is not determined by the perpetrator, it's determined by what would a reasonable person, having regard to the circumstances, would they be impacted? Would they be hurt? Would they feel unsafe, psychological or physical? And we do know that intention is often the first line of defence if we were to bring someone to account for their inappropriate behaviour. Why does it happen? 7 key reasons. Behaviour is not seen as important enough to be a performance indicator for the reward and recognition programs that you have. It could be colleague indifference, and that runs in harmony with the next one. It's been tolerated over time. So when colleagues don't react, then it must be okay. It must be me. So inaction to address the issues. So this is complacency and really managerial abrogation where there are no consequences. So, of course, why would anyone go out of their way to try and turn back a tide that is far bigger than them? And this clarity around where is the line between unacceptable and acceptable, or above the line and below the line behaviours, as some organisations talk about it. And making it worse is one of our greatest fears, and so it just continues to happen. And of course, finally, it's someone else's job. Very easy to think that the HR police will be there to fix things if things go wrong, but they are not necessarily on the job at that time watching things unfold, and being a third party to that, it makes it very difficult for them. They need to be somewhat of the independent umpire on these things. So let's mobilise ourselves to think about what we can do in the organisation at an employee level, because it does have a significant impact on workplace culture. I've developed this bystander action model to really create conversation and dialogue and options for people to think about what they're comfortable doing, provided that doing nothing is considered not an option. And in workplace health and safety legislation, we have always been alerted to the fact that our acts, whether they may have a physical or psychological impact to others, are our responsibility to manage. But we also need to be mindful that that same legislation talks about our inaction to take appropriate action. So it's not just about what we do, but what we choose not to do. We have a liability and a responsibility. So this model looks at from passive through to more active, and of course the degree of impact that can have in the organisation is going to expand. Let's look at the bottom quadrant, role modelling respectful behaviour, bringing our best selves to work. We're not always perfect, and I'm sure some slip-ups will be accepted if our genuine demeanour and genuine behaviour is respectful. Getting involved in change, and I'll talk about that in a moment and detail that with you, but there are organisations often call for expressions of interest for people to want to be part of, and generally it's part of change initiatives, and it's be terrific if the organisation doesn't see a need, but if there's a groundswell of employees that see a need, maybe they can take that to the appropriate areas such as human resources or managers more broadly. Step in and support the individual. We're moving now into the thinking about individuals and getting ourselves involved. So stepping in and supporting, we'll come back to that to expand on that. And the last one, calling out the poor behaviour. It sits where it sits because it's high on impact and high on having a significant consequence for the workplace culture if we are to call out poor behaviour when we see it. So in these four options here, to mobilise the workforce to build a culture of greater respect, safety and genuine inclusion. As I said, we'd come back and visit the advocate for change, and I think a 4-point process is helpful here to think about how we might be involved in establishing pulse checks, to check on the workforce, to see whether they agree that everyone feels respected. I did this recently as a I did a survey, pre-work for coming together to have this conversation. And it was surprising to see that 30% of the workforce felt that not everyone was respected all the time. And that gave license then to have really meaty conversations, because we could talk about, and what I'd captured was some specific examples of disrespect, some of the ones you saw earlier, and there's no getting away from the fact this was our organisation. This wasn't some abstract notion sitting out there as some other organisation has the problem, not us. We had to actually confront the reality, and it was confronting. When we look at the data, we can see whether there might be target areas or culture hotspots which might be harbouring poor behaviour. It might draw our attention to hyper-competitive practices between teams. It could talk about the silos where they don't see the value that other departments other than theirs are contributing to the goals of the organisation. It could be a general conversations around negativity being recognised, being applauded, and that generally is a spiral down where everyone tries to better the negativity of the last person, or general language that has had currency and allowed to prevail, and without the language of a bystander action and intervention, we don't have too many options. If it's not illegal, then we let it go. To instigate is to get involved in clarifying, re-educating, and that might be articulating what our values are more than we had done in the past. Perhaps it's time to revisit those values. Are they the same values that we need to drive our organisation forward towards success? It's 2020. How long have they been in place? Do they need a refresh? Could we put our hand up to be involved on that? And are we clarifying the above the line and below the line behaviours? And do we need to educate managers on redress measures, how to have courageous conversations with employees when when they're perhaps good performers, which is always the tension. You can hear people say, we don't really like how they work, but boy, they're really good at what they do. Is that enough for a diverse workforce to thrive and be genuinely inclusive of all? Let's look over to improve. How could we build in a system where behaviours are just as important as what we've delivered against our performance indicators? And how do we link positive behaviour to rewards and recognition? Maybe it's time to have those conversations, revisit those in terms of behaviours, not just quantifiable achievements. The step in box was the one down the left, the right-hand lower quadrant. Here there are 4 main main steps. The first being create a diversion. If you see how you can be very active but not take the brunt of it yourself, is to create the diversion with either the person who's being impacted or the person who's doing the impacting. It's a very clever way to take the heat off people, and we can do that in a very thoughtful way. It could be just to ask them a question, to cut them off in the middle of their conversation that might be heading in a direction that you don't want, to change the subject and move their thinking to something else. Think about checking in with that person who's been impacted, because they may not be okay. And they may need our assurance for step 3 is to reaffirm that that behaviour was not okay and it was not their fault. A lot of people who feel victimised think that they may have contributed to this in some way, and that paralyses them from taking action. And that action could involve actually talking with the person, whether at the time or at a later date preferably, and seeing if you can share with them the pain that you've experienced or the impact that you've experienced and how it made you feel. There are also other actions such as reporting that person or EAP, provided you have the systems in place for that to happen. But beware that the person who is impacted may need to process what has happened, and it may take them some time to move from the emotional state to the rational, let's take action, and no, this is not acceptable, no, I did not bring that on, it was not my fault, and so we need to address this so that it doesn't happen again. And lastly, calling it out. There's some considerations that are important to people here, and the first one is to think about, assess your own identity and safety needs, because the last thing you want is to have two people impacted, not just one. And so your relationship with the person is very fundamental to that. And I would suggest you really consider whether it's important to have that conversation now, because the relationship is strong enough that you can have that conversation, or step two is to think about the timing and perhaps consider deferring that, not too far out into the future, but at a time where you can speak privately, and that may have a greater benefit for both of you. In that conversation, it's really important to outline what you saw and heard and give the person an opportunity to respond to that. But what you saw and heard is a first-person experience, so it's not that they can walk away that it happened or didn't happen. You did see it happen. Think about including impact statements about what the person felt, because often this is missed and in the conversations, and so people don't get to transition to a position where they can appreciate and empathise with how that may have made that person feel. And to think about the improving option is to assume that the person is unaware of the impact, because that sets up the dialogue in a much more healthy way, and it won't get into a negative spiral of labelling. So providing this in a coaching environment. I know that we don't often give coaching techniques to the workforce at large. Perhaps we should. And because coaching is about reflecting and asking that person to do most of the talking, reflecting and steering the conversation so that it can be helpful for curtailing similar behaviour in the future. Think about the systems that support this workforce mobilisation of people to bystander activism. Do management support it? Because if you are calling it out, you want to be sure that management is going to support you in this, and those conversations need to happen. I talk about shared language and shared knowledge because in the respect at work and diversity and inclusion work I do, we have some really meaty and meaningful conversations which give people new language to tackle some of these challenges in the workplace, and to give permission and to say that from now on, this is going to be how we're going to deal with some of the gnarly challenges that we haven't addressed properly in the past. And there needs to be reliable avenues of redress. That is, informal grievance and formal grievance procedures, safety for people to report, and contact officers wherever possible who may be trained in and skilled in this, being a sounding board for people where it doesn't escalate, and can be a great place to think about options. And lastly, consequences for poor behaviour, whether that be for people maybe who need a bit of counselling, who might need some disciplinary action, right up to the inevitable termination of employment. There needs to be consequences for ongoing, significant poor behaviour that is disrespectful, creates an unsafe workplace psychologically or physically for others, and lacks genuine inclusion. So in wrapping up, what we've covered today is really some forms of disrespect at work, the cost of incivility at a personal and organisational level, the degree to which people need to be aware of and motivated to get involved, and think about the bystander action model as a framework to think about options. And also those essential workplace system supports that need to be there to ensure that we have a workplace that can be respectful, be safe and genuinely inclusive for all. My details are here. Please take a screenshot and get in touch. Would love your feedback, and I'm also on LinkedIn. I look forward to your feedback and to sharing this with others.